Ave Maria Stella.
Hello and welcome back to Vatican II in a Year. This is your host, Father Matthew Schneider. I am a priest of the Legionaries of Christ and I teach theology. This is a podcast on the Starcrest Production Network at sqpn.com. J. Ronde 255, we're coming at Gentis 17 to 18 on the importance of lay catechists and religious in mission. Religious here refer to those who have vows like myself. 17 is on the catechist, 18 on religious. If you want to follow along, we have a reading plan and more details at sqpn.com/Vatican or frmatthewlc.com/Vatican. Yesterday we spoke about how some young men from mission fields will be called to the priesthood, and they should get a good formation, but also adapted to their mission where they are. Today we're going to conclude Chapter 2, Mission Work Itself, conclude Article 3, Forming a Christian Community, and we're going to talk about those two things we mentioned above. Catechists are a great help to the mission, and various forms of religious life should be present in mission areas. So going into 17 on catechists, this has 5 subparagraphs. Going to read in 3 parts. A and B, catechists are praiseworthy as assistants to priests. C, we need schools to teach catechists. And D and E, we should formalize the process of becoming a catechist and recognize part-time catechists. One of the things that's important to note here is that for the large part here, what they're talking about with catechists are people who are more full-time dedicated, not just somebody who spends 2 hours a week teaching one class of catechism. Those are kind of the part-time ones recognized at the end. What we're talking about are people who are full-time, more like the director of religious education, the religion teacher at a Catholic school, things like that. In our culture, we don't have as many of these full-time ones who might go out to villages and things like that because our social structure is currently set up a little differently than this is mainly referred to. But anyways, let's get into A and B. A, likewise worthy of praise are the ranks of men and women catechists, well deserving of missionary work to the nations. Imbued with the apostolic spirit, they labor much to make an outstanding and altogether necessary contribution to the spread of the faith and of the church. B, in our time when there are so few clerics to preach the gospel to such great numbers and to exercise pastoral ministry, the position of catechist is of great importance. Therefore, their training must be so accomplished and so adapted to advances on the cultural level that as reliable co-workers of the priestly order, they may perform their task well, though it be weighed down with new and greater burdens. So this starts with the idea of catechists being a praiseworthy job. We should praise them, we should thank them, we should glorify them. Well, not glorify them in the sense of worshiping God, but thank them and do all they can because they make this great contribution to the faith. It is wonderful to see people who dedicate their lives to teaching about Jesus. And one of the notes here is they talk about there's few priests, and this is more in the mission territory. But even if we think of the U.S. as a mission territory, this was the early 1960s. At that time frame, we had the peak of number of priests in the U.S. And, around the time of this document. And that's just a note to say, hey, we still, when we talk about today, we're lacking priests. We've always been lacking priests. We've always wanted more priests. And we also need the laity to preach. We need formation to this too. We're not just going to send somebody out and say, hey, preach, like no formation. No, that's not fair to them. But we can give them formation, which is what we talk about in C. We need schools to teach catechists. So here schools can be any kind of thing, like from a certification course. Some seminaries offer kind of an evening classes for people who are going to be full-time catechists or things like that. To an associate's degree, other types of things like that. But let's read paragraph C. There should therefore be an increase in the number of schools, both on the diocesan and on the regional levels, wherein future catechists may study Catholic doctrine, especially in the fields of Scripture and the liturgy, as well as catechetical method and pastoral practice, schools wherein they can develop in themselves a Christian character, and wherein they can devote themselves tirelessly to cultivating piety and sanctity of life. Moreover, conventions or courses should be held in which at certain times catechists could be refreshed in the disciplines and skills useful for their ministry, and in which their spiritual life could be nourished and strengthened. In addition, for those who devote themselves entirely to this work, a decent standard of living should be provided and social security by paying them a just wage. So here they talk about teaching catechists, teaching these people like the DREs, the kind of religion teachers, and have them either diocesan level, regional level. And also the thing is, we'll have conferences and professional development programs. There's a number of dioceses that run programs where they have once a year for religion teachers and catechists or something like that, or one day. And that's very helpful because it's good to keep that, refreshed. And finally, it notes we need to pay catechists, which is important because people need to make a living. I know, for example, several youth ministers who've left because they couldn't make enough money once they had once they had a baby at home and their wife needed to stay home with the baby for a year or two. Or, for example, I know in a diocese, I'm not going to name names here, but there was a priest who put out a job listing for a youth minister and put in the salary range. And a bunch of the other priests in the diocese got a little annoyed because his salary range was significantly higher than theirs, and his salary range wasn't that high. The person who ended up taking it had been teaching at a school, I think at a public school, and she actually took a reduction in pay to be the youth minister. But she was still able to get enough money being a youth minister. So those kind of things are important. And I think this idea of youth ministers here are similar to what it is. I know, for example, with the Legion and Regnum Christi, we have funded what are called evangelizadores de tiempo completo, or full-time catechists in parts of rural Mexico where we train them, and then they go out and visit all these little villages that might not be super far in distance, but are up on hills and mountains where you need to go with donkeys because there's no paved roads. And so they are time-wise quite distant from the larger towns or the parishes. And so it's great for a priest, a pastor, to have somebody they can send up like that who would be a catechist. So moving on to D and E, we should formalize the process of becoming catechists and recognize part-time catechists. And for most of us, part-time catechists are probably what we more think of when we think of a catechist, like a parish catechist or something like that. So let's read the numbers, or the letters, whatever you want to say. 17 D and E's. D. It should be desirable for the Sacred Congregation for the Propagation of Faith to provide special funds for the due training and support of catechists. It seems necessary and fitting let a special opus bono pro catechists be founded. E. Moreover, the Church should be gratefully acknowledge the noble work being done by auxiliary catechists, whose help they will need. These preside over prayers of the communities and teach sacred doctrine. Something suitable should be done for their doctrinal and spiritual training. Besides this, we hope that, where it seems opportune, catechists who are duly trained should receive a missio canonica in publicly celebrated liturgical ceremony, so that the eyes of people they may serve the faith with greater authority. So that paragraph D is talking about the need for funding and things like that. I kind of brought that in the full-time evangelist at the end of the last paragraph. And this is something we need to do. That talks about opus bono, opus pro catechists, which is to work for catechists, kind of fundraising thing. I don't know if the Vatican does that, but I do know a number of Catholic charities that do that. Like it's Catholic World Mission would be the one funding the full-time catechists, for example. And then it's talking about catechists, and it's acknowledged them. And it talks about the auxiliary catechists. Those would be the part-time ones, the kind of volunteer ones who would volunteer a few hours a week type thing. And that's what we think of for catechists most often in the U.S. And it talks about this missio canonica, which is just the canonical mission, canonical mandate, to make it formal. What is a catechist, who is a catechist, and what kind of training they have, and who's not a catechist, because they don't have that training or they don't have that certification from their bishop. I know for theology professors, we go through a similar process. It's a little more strict because they go through and look. They don't just look at our training, they actually look at what we wrote and things like that. And if I start writing heretical things, the bishop can withdraw that. But that's a whole other thing. So moving on to paragraph 18. It's 4 subparagraphs. I'm going to read it in 2 parts, A and B, C and D. A and B, religious should be present from the beginning of evangelization and adapt to cultures. C and D, we need various forms of religious life, including contemplatives. So obviously this number is about religious in the missions. So let's begin. A, right from the planting stage of the church, the religious life should be carefully fostered. This not only offers precious and absolutely necessary assistance to the missionary activity, but by a more inward conservation made to God and the church, it also clearly manifests and signifies the inner nature of the Christian calling. B, religious institutes working to plant the church and thoroughly imbued with the mystic treasures with which the church's religious tradition is adorned, should strive to give expression to them and hand them on according to the nature and genius of each nation. Let them reflect attentively on how Christian religious life might be able to assimilate the aesthetic and contemplative traditions whose seeds were sometimes planted by God in each cultures already prior to the preaching of the gospel. So this is pointing out that we should have religious present from the very beginning of when we do missions. I remember there's a missionary bishop, and he was pleading with different Carmelites to send a few sisters so they could start a Carmelite monastery because he knew that their prayers would be super valuable. But here it's also talking about them, founding the churches and different things. A lot of the missions were often done by religious. Historically, the first missions, when you go to almost any country in the world outside of Europe and the Mediterranean basin, the ones who sent there to all the different parts of the Americas, to Africa, to Asia, it was usually religious sent first. And then they built up a local church. And religious, we also show this inward consecration of the church. We show the evangelical counsels, even though not everyone is called to live poverty, chastity, and obedience as we do. They are counsels from Christ. They are ideals that we can show forth and present to everyone as examples. And that's important. And as different religious communities, they have a great heritage. We all have different heritage in our communities, whether it's Jesuit, Franciscan, etc. And you need to adapt those sometimes to certain things of time and place. Some are very simple. For example, I know my own community in a few countries of the world, a few cities of the world and countries, will wear different clothes because it's just too hot to wear our standard garb. And that's just adapting to those cultures that are just very hot, very many days a year. And obviously there's a lot more in detail they can go into. And I'm not expert enough to speak about that I'm going to give precise examples that really work out there. But moving on to C and D, we need various forms of religious life, including contemplatives. C is about the different active communities. D is about contemplatives. C, various forms of religious life are to be cultivated in the young churches, in order that they might display various aspects of the mission of Christ in the life of the church, and may devote themselves to various pastoral works and preparation for and prepare their members to exercise them rightly. On the other hand, the bishops in their conference should see to it that congregations pursuing the same apostolic aims are not multiplied to the detriment of religious life and to the apostolate. D, worthy of special mention are the various projects causing the contemplative life to take root. There are those who in such an attempt have kept the essential element of monastic institution and are bent on implanting that rich tradition in their order. But there are others again who are returning to simpler forms of ancient monasticism. But all students are looking for a genuine adaptation to local conditions, since the contemplative life belongs to the fullness of the church's present, let it be put into effect everywhere. So, just before I started noting this, I mentioned apostolic and contemplative religious. Those are just categories of religious we generally talk about, whereas communities that go out and do apostolate, whether teaching, forming apostles, spiritual direction, whether it's running hospitals, things like that, they're called active or apostolic communities. And then the ones who mainly just stay in the monastery and pray are called contemplative. And the exact distinction is not always absolute, because you can't have like a Benedictine monastery where there is quite a bit of action. They're running a college or things like that. But you'll have another Benedictine monastery which is very contemplative. So it's more of a spectrum than an absolute A and B, but this is really important. There are some that are absolutely contemplative. They don't really do any external apostolate, but their whole work is to pray for the church. And so we need the various forms of the apostolic life. We need ones who run hospitals, ones who run schools, ones who help in parish catechesis, all these different things. And that's very different. And there's going to be ones that serve different population. They help in the pastoral work. And obviously we don't want them to be in competition where there's two Catholic schools starting 200 meters apart when it's an area where that's far, far from needed. And then neither of them can succeed because neither of them get the kind of like number of students to pay all the bills. And it causes both to fail rather than one succeeding. And the other one would have succeeded had they gone to the other side of the city or something. And we have to welcome these monastic or contemplative communities. It's very valuable. They don't need nearly as much adaptation in general because the idea of the contemplative life is pretty standard. Obviously, the language they speak in their community for their communal prayers, which they'll pray like the Liturgy of the Hours throughout the day, might be different. And things like their habit. If you're in somewhere that's very hot, you might not wear as thick of a habit as you might if you were in northern Germany or something like that. Hopefully this is helpful. Thank you for listening to this episode of Vatican II in a Year. This is a listener-supported podcast, and you can help StarQuest produce other great podcasts like it by donating at sqpn.com/give. You can give one-time, monthly, or join the StarQuest Patreon. Tomorrow, we'll continue with the next paragraph of Ad Gentes. which is 19 on the idea from a mission to a particular church, how that transformation happens. Please join us then to learn more about Vatican II, which can provide a blueprint for the Catholic Church. If you want more information on the podcast, like playlists for individual documents and a reading plan, go to sqpn.com/Vatican, frmatthewlc.com/Vatican, or Vatican SQPN on Facebook and X.